and a very warm welcome to our 137th Security Thought Leadership webinar. And for those of you who've been joining us all the time, you know the idea of thought leadership is that we critique today in order that we may get a better type of provision tomorrow. And as is our way, we've invited three panelists along to give their views on this topic. And the topic today, like many of the topics we choose, emerged from a previous webinar. And those of you who attend regularly know that a while back we did one on victim support, and someone wrote to me afterwards and said, well, a version of victim support is giving them the opportunity to meet offenders. And we're going to ask today, is it a good idea or is it a flawed concept? Where's the evidence that it works? And whose interests are being served here? Is it the victim in having a chance to express his, her, or their anger? Or is it about the offenders learning from the experience and in some way reflecting in a way that's going to make them better in the future? Well, to address this, we have two panelists from the UK and one from Benelux. And so what I'm going to do in a second is I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves. And once they've each done that, I will then invite each of them to make their opening statement. 3 minutes when they get to say whatever they want to say about the topic. So without further ado, let's go and meet our panelists. And first of all, let's go and meet Janine. Janine, please introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you, Martin. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, my name's Janine Carroll, and I'm a director of Restorative now. And I've got over 30 years experience in the field of restorative justice, restorative practice. And I deliver training in the art of bringing people together to talk. Thank you.
Okay, I've just got a connection on my end saying my internet is unstable. Would you believe it? First time in 137 webinars that it happens, and it happens here. Thank you very much indeed, Janine. I got that. Let's now meet Deirdre. Now, Deirdre, when we met beforehand, was saying very nice things about Janine. But Deirdre, let's hear from you.
Hi there. Thank you so much for inviting me to take part today. I feel very honoured to be sharing a platform with Janine, who has taught me many things over the years about restorative practice and been an inspiration and a source of guidance and advice. I'm a team manager in a large youth offending team in South London with a very high crime rate. I have responsibility for victims and restorative justice. I manage about 140 volunteers as well as a group of staff. And we run referral orders, which is a restorative disposal of the courts. I do a bit of teaching and training. And I'm also a volunteer mediator in a neighbouring borough, involved in neighbour disputes and previously involved in neighbourhood justice panels, which dealt with low-level conflict and crime, where both parties wanted to resolve things satisfactorily. Unfortunately, the funding ran out for those. And so people are back in court because we have no more funding for them. However, we are still mediating, and I believe as much in community mediation as I do in the restorative justice that we do in my job with young offenders and the people they've harmed. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Deirdre. Well, many things we'll come back to there, not least relying on volunteers. Let's go over to Belgium now and meet B. B, can you just introduce yourself to us, please?
Hello, thank you for this invitation. I'm honored to be here, and my name is Bee, and I work as a victim offender mediator in Belgium, and I also implemented the family group conferencing in Belgium as well in the French-speaking part of the Netherlands-speaking part of Belgium. On behalf of that, I am also a mediator in the youth care, where there are mediations between clients and institutions and parents where there are problems. And I'm also a trainer of the European Forum of Restorative Justice.
B, thank you very much indeed. Well, that's our panel expert once again. I know you're impressed with the panelists we invite because you write and tell me so, and another excellent lineup. So Let me just say that at the bottom of your screens, you will see a chat button. So if you want to chat to one another, you can do it there. And some of you already started. If you want to ask a question to the panel, can I ask you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen? Please try and get your question in early. And if you get it in early, we'll try and incorporate it into the discussion that follows the 3 opening statements. That's the chance for every one of the panelists now to say what they think about this topic. So let's go back to Janine. And Janine, can we have your opening statement, please?
Thank you, Martin. So our theme is that giving victims the right to meet those who've offended against them, especially looking at reparation process. And I definitely think this is a good idea, but I feel somewhat hesitant to agree with the point as it's worded at the minute, because in fact, I'd flip it on its head and ask, well, whose right is it to deny this potential for dialogue? Because after all, whose incident is it that's happened which has affected both these people? And what's on offer to each of them in meeting to talk? And we see in the theme the word reparation, but I would ask, reparation of what? Because there's a lot more on offer to have restored here than simply a fence or the cost of an injury or a car or whatever. There's information on offer here. There's a recognition of the power of the voice of each of these people and the opportunity for each of them to learn so much more about the context within which this matter arose. And therefore it's enabling so much more than simply reparation, perhaps around fixed sums of money or actions to be undertaken, but it's more about reparation of and repair of personal dignity, of a sense of safety, of a sense of being more than our negative behavior. So really what I would see on offer here is the opportunity for people to meet and talk. And this is a basic human right. And when we look at the ethos of, for instance, restorative practice alongside United Nations charters of rights, we often see a theme playing out where individuals impacted by events must be placed at the heart of their resolution. And that's what I see as being on offer to people impacted by events who now are afforded the opportunity to talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Janine. Really interesting. Without further ado, just to remind you, question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. If you get your questions in early, we'll endeavour to incorporate it into the discussion. Let's hear from our second panellist then. Deirdre, your thoughts, please.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the background to restorative justice. In the UK, it is firmly embedded in the youth system. We still don't use it enough. We still don't use it well enough, but it's there in legislation. I came to it, though, from, I first discovered it in a restorative justice project in rural Mississippi many years ago, where few Black people had faith in the white sheriff. And I've realized since then that restorative practice is relational justice, is the justice of communities. It came up through Indigenous groups the world over, from Janine's home nation, the Maoris in New Zealand, the Canadian First Nation communities, who were challenging European justice systems that often discriminated against them and made no sense in their cultures. I'd like to highlight the fact that the many cultures like the Desmond Tutu, the ANC in South Africa, brought in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to try and bring a different approach to a national crisis over racism and inequality and injustice. And many countries have readopted or revisited these alternative justice systems. And I think in the context that I work in a multiracial environment in South London, restorative justice often makes a lot more sense than our legal system. I just wanted to briefly raise 3 issues that are quite important in restorative justice. and people may be interested in thinking about them a bit further. But one is how far should victims influence what happens to offenders? And coming back to Janine's point about who should ever have the right to deny a victim that choice. But then when does the justice system become a revenge system? The second point is the third player in restorative justice is the community. And community justice can end up being kneecapping or stoning. It can be a very cruel, very unequal, very unfair kind of justice. How do we ensure that the community involvement is fair, open, non-discriminatory? The third point, and this is a huge area for development, and there are lots of developments going on in restorative justice in this area. Many forms of harm, like low-level sexual violence or hate crime, for example, are really poorly dealt with by the blunt instrument of mainstream justice. And many victims of these offences don't even want to get involved in a traditional justice process. RJ, however, depends on people taking some responsibility for what they've done. And this is where it can be quite difficult to enable restorative justice to take place in these contexts. I'm just going to finish by saying, in my day job, we see over 80% of victims who get involved in any kind of restorative process satisfied with it, having their needs met. Not all of them, but a lot of their needs met. And for young offenders, I think it's transformative in many cases, seeing young people change as they take responsibility, as they learn empathy. I think it's the best thing that ever happened in our youth justice system. Thank you.
Well, that's an endorsement, Deirdre. Thank you very much indeed. Don't forget, if you've got a question or you want to pick one of the panelists up, do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll come to you after we've heard from our third panelist. B, let's hear from you in your opening statement, please.
So I also want to start with the fact that in Belgium, the restorative justice is embedded in the law. I worked with minors, so every minor and a victim get from the prosecutor or the youth judge an offer of a mediation. I think that's a good thing, that it's an offer of mediation. So we do a home visit by the victim, by the offender, and we speak about the offer of mediation. We hear their stories, and we also look if they want to get involved in this mediation process. And I say it's a process because I think the process is more important than the result. If we come to an agreement, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is the process, and it's to give a voice to the victim, but also to the offender, because often at the moment of the offense, the victim has lost his voice. And by talking to a mediator, a neutral person, they can tell their emotions. And I think when I come to the question, giving victims the right to meet those who offended against them, I think the right, yes, they have the right, but they have to choose whether if they want to meet their offender, yes or no. And that's part of the mediation process, that you go in a conversation with the victim, and here's what are her needs, his needs, what does he want to get from the offender. So that is what you do in a conversation, and I think it's good that they can meet each other, but I think the preparation time to meet is a very important thing. When you do a good preparation, then I think you can, as a mediator in a direct meeting, you can put lay back, and they are going to talk one another. So I think it's when I have to conclude, I think you have to give the victim the right to meet their offender, and I think it's very important to prepare very well this direct meeting, or the way how the process of the mediation will take part. And it's also very important to take good care of the parties. When you see that one of them has not the good ID to meet, the offender has not a good ID to meet his victim, then you have to take it in content and you have to talk about it with the both parties. So that's my point of view.
B, thank you very much indeed. And three very interesting opening statements, all offering some very different insights into the process, looking at the potential advantages. Now, let me come to each of the panelists, and let me take a question first that was sent in advance from a Penny Oniyoko. I'm so sorry, Penny Oniyoko, I think the name's pronounced. The question is to panelists is, do we have evidence, independent evidence, that this works, that this process works? And I think you raised an interesting question, B, and I know is mentioned a different way in other two, that what works needs thinking about here, because just the process of going about meeting people is in itself evidence. So I wonder whether you could just sort of each point to evidence of either working or not working to persuade the more skeptical about the merits of this. Let me start with you, Janine. Independent evidence this work, is it there?
Definitely there, yes. In my own work, I've run a lot of projects which have all been evaluated to look at outcomes attained. And the question's an interesting one. Does it work? And as you've highlighted, Martin, what does work look like? Have the individuals who've participated in the dialogue felt that much of their needs have been met? And definitely, I've run many projects, especially most recently in youth justice settings, on looking at harmful sexual behaviour, violence in the home, all sorts of behaviours which have meant then that for young people involved in those matters, there's been opportunities for them to talk to other people who've been closely connected with that event. And it might have been a community-based victim, or it might have been a family member. And then we measure gains in empathy, diminution of shame, a strength in the relationship now since the dialogues occurred, a shift in the behaviour after the dialogues occurred. And even in the adult jurisdiction, figures looking at up to 85% of satisfaction for people who felt harmed by the perpetrator of that action. And also quite a few statistical measures around shifts in behaviour, or even a cessation of offending behaviour in adult populations, up to 27%. And that's because when the dialogue occurs, there is an interplay here of learning. And as we know in all our lives, if relationships hit bumps and harm's caused, it's by the talking and the sharing that so much learning's on offer to the parties involved. So that for people who've hurt others, often that action has come from a place of hurt within themselves. And when they meet and talk, there's healing on offer to both these people. There's an incremental gain in emotional and social development as a result, so that people can then use that empathy to moderate their behaviour moving forward in life. So behaviours definitely change and become more pro-social for some of the cohort who participate in those conversations.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Deirdre, your thoughts on this issue? Independent evidence.
I completely agree with Janine. It works. Statistically, we have good statistics for victims. There hasn't been as much research done on offenders. I know our offending rates for those who've been through a restorative process are around, reoffending rates are around a third, which sounds really shockingly high, but is actually quite low for our reoffending justice rates anyway. But I'd like to tell a little story that illustrates it much better. We had a little boy who'd been he'd stolen a car, a young man, he wasn't a little boy, a young man who'd stolen a car with a baby seat in it. He went through a restorative process. We saw him in our waiting room again a few months later, and he said, what are you doing here? And he came up and he said, look, I stole a car, but I checked really carefully that there wasn't a baby seat in it, because I know what the impact on that family was when I took the car with the baby seat. So, we're talking incremental change. We're talking a kid who's learnt a bit of empathy. He's learnt to listen to the victim of the offence, but there may be other things going on in his life that work against him giving up offending altogether. But that transformation, that building of empathy is really key. I see it day in, day out in the young people we work with. community mediation as well. We enable neighbours who haven't spoken to each other for ages to carry on living together, to develop a way of building dialogue. They may not become friends, but they learn to speak to each other, and they have avoided a very costly court case that might intensify their conflict anyway. So it undoubtedly works in that area as well.
Thank you. B, Deirdre says undoubtedly works. Agree?
I agree totally. And although when a victim meets his offender and she doesn't get the answers she wanted to hear, it can be helpful. It can be also say, yes, I thought he was going to give the good answer, but I got a wrong answer. So I know that that's what I get. So I have to continue with that answer. So even though that can help a victim when he knows that he doesn't get the right answer, but what the offender can give. So I think also that the dialogue is very important, that they can express their feelings, that they can say what they need to continue in their lives. And in the most of the files where there was a direct meeting, I see that the victim was released afterward, also the offender, but both the parties are relieved after they have spoken about their feelings, to express why something happens. Because often what's a victim, what's an offender is sometimes also a victim of his situation. So that's also important to get this expression and to tell this to a victim, what was his why he did this offense, and to express this also to the when they can hear one another what they say. I think that's a very good thing.
I think that's an interesting distinction Bee's making, Martin, because often people see these dialogues in the context that it's about atonement, and that the offending person will be called to account and take responsibility and apologize. And all of that may well happen within this dialogue, but really, rather than looking at atonement, it's much more, I've noticed over 30 years of doing it, that it's about attunement, and that these two start to get each other. And rather than it being about correction and seeing, well, is this behavior going to be corrected? It's not so much correction as connection, because these two suddenly start to get each other. And really, they're nothing other than two humans with a pulse who've each been impacted by this event they now share in perpetuity. And it's a must, really, that they come together and talk and share the variety of perception and the impact they've each carried as a result, so that they can then collaborate to work out, how do we lay this down and move beyond it and be more than we were before it happened.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to move on because we've got questions coming, and very good questions, I might, and I want to make sure we do justice to them. So let's just take a question from Glenn Kitteringham first, because former panelist. And I wonder if I could adapt Glenn's question to the point that you've all spoken about these schemes in glowing terms. One must wonder they're not an unqualified good. You've spoken, one immediate thought comes to mind is this drawing finance away from other measures? How much public support is there for this initiative? And I just wonder what the problems are, or whether there are redeeming vices, so to speak, that might make this less attractive. Deirdre, let me ask you first. I mean, there's nothing that's got an unqualified good. No.
Well, yeah, there are problems. There are problems. It's often difficult. In my context, we really struggle to engage young victims because the levels of fear of reprisal are so huge. It's so, you know, we're constantly trying to enable victims to feel safe enough to even report a crime, actually, when we're dealing with kind of gang issues, with drug dealing, with kind of a lot of fear and intimidation. So that's definitely a problem. It's definitely a huge challenge for us. Yeah, I'm just trying to. Yes, the other thing I was going to say is that a number of victims don't want any more. We have a duty to make contact with every victim, as does B. I think you were talking about that in the Netherlands, B. We have a duty to make contact with every victim, but lots of victims don't want any more. So we'll always have a large percentage of victims who just don't want to be involved. But those who do want to be involved have a very wide range of needs, and it's so important that somebody in the justice system is there to listen to them, to listen to their story, to listen to their needs. It may well be then that the offender, the victim doesn't want to meet the offender. The offender is, we might assess the offender as not being suitable to meet the victim. We have to risk assess. Generally, we'll do everything we can if the victim wants to meet, to make sure that happens, managing expectations. Look, this guy is not remorseful. He's not apologetic. And if the victim still wants to go ahead and we feel we can manage, it's not going to be a physical risk, we'll go ahead. But it's a complicated process. And as B also said, that preparation is absolutely everything. Risk assessment, preparation, and being very careful, taking time. It's not a cheap option. It's cheaper than the courts, but it's not a cheap option because it takes a lot of time. We have to sit down and listen to people properly, deeply, trying to understand what they're saying, what they need, what they want, and managing issues such as risk and safety.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Let me just come to you, B. I just wonder whether, from a Belgian context, are there any challenges, or let me a different way of put it. What are the main challenges you have in offering an effective scheme?
To a victim or an offender? To a victim.
To both.
To both. The main challenges. Oh, that's a difficult question. What do I have to say about it? I think a challenge is we work with minors. There are parents, and often the parents doesn't have the same feeling or meaning as their child who is affected or has committed the offense. And I think we have also to deal with this situation. So often the parents say, my son hasn't done anything, so he doesn't have to do a mediation. Or when they have financial issues and the victim has how do you say, does want a financial Ali, do you understand what I want to say?
Yeah, sure.
They want financial
compensation.
Yeah.
Yes. So then at that time, they are going to say, we are not going to do a mediation because we have to pay and my son hasn't done anything. So then we have to look with the parents and the offender, how we are going to deal with this situation. What I also see that sometimes a victim wants to meet their offender. I have a situation of a girl of 16 who was sexually abused by an offender, and she wanted to meet her offender because she has written some questions and she wanted him to answer these questions because he felt remorse at the end of the offense. And the parents, they in the beginning they didn't want her to speak to her offender, and then we looked how we could arrange this meeting, and we came to a solution. And so the parents say, yes, you can meet your offender. So it depends on how parents look to their son, to their offender, to their victim, how you can deal, and that's sometimes a challenge. You have to mediate within the family.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me build on that, and I'll come to you, Janine, if I might. I want to combine two questions, if I might, Janine. The first one is from Andrea Nietzsche, and she's asking about whether there's a difference depending on the kind of crime and the severity. Does the work more successfully, or does this work successfully or at all when it's a damage or theft, for example, or when it's rape or bodily harm? Now, let me just hold on to that thought, because there's a context here from Ruth Andrews. And panelists, I've actually done one study on reparation, which was actually with regards to fraud victims. And Ruth's question is this, and so let me put it to you, Janine, first, if I might. What is your view about victims of frauds which involve an element of grooming? We had a case where a vulnerable male was groomed over 8 years by the suspects. The main offender requested a reparation meeting with the victim, who had spent 18 months helping to recover from the loss of his friends and who defrauded him over 250,000, and whose arrests left him bereaved because he thought they were friends. And I guess this is the point about presumably, is this more fitting for some crimes than others? Or Janine, is this about the individuals involved regardless of crimes?
Thank you. Yes, I'd go with the latter. We've talked a lot about the importance of preparation. So in the individual meeting stage, the facilitator of the process would be very astute at looking at the authenticity of these people and their readiness and clarity to be able to enter into the dialogue with the other. So that might address the part of the comment there about perhaps the safety and also the veracity of bringing people together. But in terms of the behaviours, the crimes as such, or the actions, I can't think of any action that I haven't done a meeting about. So I don't make a distinction over the actual behaviours that have occurred at all, because after all, once again, we pivot back to whose is this incident and who are the key people impacted by this incident, and who can ever deny them the right to meet and talk and sort this directly. And so I've done that across a huge range of behaviours and situations.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Let me come to you, Deirdre, on the action end of this, because first of all, if you agree with that, if you do, you mentioned you rely on volunteers, didn't you, to practice this? I'm just wondering how prepared volunteers or those who run schemes are, because that is an onerous responsibility Janine's just outlined here. If it's on, even if it's not a sensitive offence, it might be a sensitive to the people in victim and offender involved. How do you ensure quality in that context? Deirdre?
Well, first of all, we have a lot of volunteers who are involved in a wide range of activities, but the in-depth restorative practice is done by professionals who are accredited. We have the Restorative Justice Council, which does accreditation. There are other forms of other accreditation bodies in the UK. It would be extremely dangerous and irresponsible to set a volunteer who's done maybe basic training onto a case on their own, possibly. And again, we would probably be, we might well be working in pairs with a more complex case. But the more complex situations will be facilitated by trained and experienced restorative justice practitioners. The other thing I wanted to add to that, though, is we may not do direct restorative justice. And in my work, most of our restorative work is not direct. We're always wanting more direct. But there are lots and lots of ways that I think particularly victims can be satisfied and have their needs met that don't involve a direct meeting. For the perpetrator, and particularly a young offender, it's always the best of the best to meet face to face. It's the most direct thing that will ever happen to them and their court order. But if the victim doesn't want it, and we find quite often that by halfway through this preparation process, the victim's needs are met. And so they might not actually then want to go ahead and actually have a direct meeting. They've exchanged, messages have been exchanged. There's possibly been a letter. The victim has been involved in the planning. What's the offender going to do to make amends, to give something back? And they actually, they decide, look, that I don't need that direct meeting. So that there are lots of different ways of managing it and keeping people safe and meeting needs. Obviously, the best is the director.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. B, Andrea's just followed up and she said, you've all spoken about the successes, but what when it goes wrong? It must go wrong sometimes, surely. I mean, are there real problems here? I mean, real problems when this goes wrong? I mean, I could imagine there might be. B?
I think when sometimes it goes wrong, but we also speak about these things in the preparation time. So when we do the preparation, then we speak with both parties. What if And that's a very important question. What if you don't get the answer you wanted to hear? Or what if he denies he did something to you? That's something that we speak about in the preparation time. So when it happens in the direct meeting, then we can say, what are you now going to do? And mostly we do a direct meeting with two persons. So one can go out with one person and speak with the person or the victim, for instance, and say, how are you now affected? What do you need now? Do you want to continue? Do you not want to continue? What are we going to tell when we go back in the meeting? So that is something that is taken in account when you do the preparation time. And then at the moment when it happens, you have some tools to talk about it and to deal with it.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, Deirdre, just very quickly, if I might, because we're running out of time and I want to get some more questions in. You were nodding in agreement when I said it sometimes goes wrong. What's the main cause of it going wrong? And has it ever been serious for a victim or an offender in terms of the impact?
Again, with the preparation, we would hopefully prevent that meeting, stop it in process if it was looking really risky. There shouldn't be too many surprises in the direct meeting when you've been through the whole preparation. I can think of one when we had a police officer and a young person, and the police officer, we couldn't get through to him as a human being. He arrived, we'd made a mistake. He arrived in uniform. We hadn't been really explicit about it. And we tried to question, to get him to be the human being, but there was something about, we hadn't managed, and we hadn't done enough preparation, early days. He represented the Met Police and we couldn't get through to the humanity. The kid really wanted to talk very emotionally about his thoughts and feelings about the police. The police officer, we couldn't get beyond, this is my duty, I have to arrest. And we failed on that human level. We failed to move from the level of the offence and talking about anger and frustration and people's jobs to an emotional meeting of two human beings.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much indeed. And I understand that. Let me come quickly, if I might, to Janine. And Janine, I've got a question here from Marion Liebman, I think, or Leibman. And just a good point, I think, about making the distinction between young people and adults. And you've made these distinctions in this conversation on the panel. Presumably there is a big difference, is there, between young people and the adults? I mean, you can almost see with young people the need to get them involved early on in thinking about the victim. Is it more daunting when it becomes adults and our adult offenders and victims equally like to be involved with equally amount of benefit? Janine?
Yes, I think the same merits are on offer for both, whether we're talking about younger people or adults. For instance, in the New Zealand legislation, every matter before the courts must be tested for a restorative opportunity. And so that's not focusing on any particular age. And much of my work has been in running hundreds of meetings in the adult jurisdiction. And I've definitely seen huge shifts in appreciation of impact and wish to meet the needs of each other in the room. And so, yeah, I think whilst we can see with young people that there is an incremental gain because they're still young and there's lots to learn, and we don't want anybody defined by their negative behavior alone. And so we're keen to engage with young people as in the dialogue too. But we've talked a lot about the art of preparation. And when we do the individual early part of the meeting separately, what we're reaching for is the engagement with these two separately at that point in what's on offer to them. What is their life task here in terms of now moving beyond the event itself to looking at the addressing of matters beyond that. And so with adults too, the chance to talk and sort something and lay it down and walk on is hugely important.
Okay, I mean, just on this, B, if I could just ask you to do a question very quickly, if you wouldn't mind, because I want to get one more question in. It's a question from Ty Weatherby. Just thinking about this importance of the meeting And Ty is just saying, but wouldn't the direct meeting, if so effective, be needed all the time? And I guess it's just this thinking, this logic that it's about victim meeting an offender, and if you haven't got there, then it must be, you can't close the loop. But the point is, it's not always like that. Very briefly, if you wouldn't mind, B.
I think it would be a good thing when in every case a victim wants to meet his offender, but as I said in the beginning, it's up to the parties. To the people, they have to choose if they want to sit together, yes or no. And as Deirdre already said, we have also indirect meetings, and there's also satisfaction because they get answers. They can also move on after an indirect meeting. So I think direct meeting is very useful, but it's to the parties to choose if they want to do it, yes or no. So I'm not going to choose it for them, but I can explain that it can be helpful and that it can work, but they have to feel if they want to do it, yes or no.
Okay. And let me just thank you very much indeed. Deirdre, I want to get one final question in. Deirdre, this strikes me as a good question, although it might not be an easy one to answer, but let me just pose it to you. It's from an anonymous attendee. And he talks about he or she, or this individual talks about many 12-step recovery programs. For example, Alcoholics Anonymous include a step which says, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. And the question is, are you familiar with this Alcoholics Anonymous type of step? And are there similarities with restorative justice on this point? So it's drawing a distinction, I think, between restorative justice bringing people together and other types of schemes bringing people together. And are these similar or are they completely different?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I also manage the reparation schemes, and I think what the person asking the question is talking about. I don't know about the 12-step recovery process. It's really interesting that there is a reparative element. It's making amends. We say doing sorry. It's trying to repair harm that you've caused, which is the essence of restorative practice. And ideally, reparation is most restorative when it is agreed between the person who's harmed and the person who's been harmed. But very often when we can't do that, we might ask the victim, the person who's been harmed, is there something you would like this person to do that would make you feel better? It may even be doing some voluntary work for their favorite charity. And then we have, because there are always a number of people where the victim may not be involved, there may not be a direct victim in the offence, where they will do sorry in the community. They'll do something in the community, but that is only meaningful if there's a really strong restorative element, that it's not doing time, it's not forcible service, it's something that they're really clear, this is a huge benefit. This is making them feel good and proud and brave and strong, because they, as an offender, are now, from doing bad, they're now doing good.
Really interesting. Panelists, thank you so much for your time. Fascinating insight. Thank you so much indeed for the questions as well. Lots of good questions there. I feel as though we could have spent a lot more time on each of them, but as you know, these thought leadership webinars are always 45 minutes and then we stop. So thank you very much indeed. Just a few final points from me, if I might. Just to say that nominations are still open for the Outstanding Security Performance Awards for those who are doing an outstanding job. In Australia, they close on the 7th of September. In Romania, on the 15th of September. They're still open in the Norway, the United Kingdom and Ireland, but you need to get your entries in before too long. So start working on them now, but prioritize Australia and Romania if you're out there. Just to say, we're on the road next Thursday, as I mentioned earlier on. We're going to be at the security event. We're on stand 3A, H70. Christine Brooks and I, so come and say hello. And we'll be out and about in September. First time we've been out and about for so long, it's unbelievable. And 3 events in a month, one in the US. So I hope to see you at one of those shows. We'll be back. Normally I'd say we'll be back next Thursday, but as I say, we're out and about next week, but we'll be back in 2 weeks' time when we'll have a webinar about the Benelux, security in the Benelux. What are the barriers to progress and how can they be overcome? And listen to this. we'll also be announcing the winners of the Benelux Oscars. That's at 2:30, 2 weeks today, 2:30 British Summertime, 2 weeks today. So thank you once again to my panel for insightful comments. Thank you once again to you, the audience, for your questions. I know that some of you are exchanging views on chat as well. Don't forget, a copy of this recording will be available on the website tomorrow. And also to note that I'll be doing a blog to go with it. So hopefully we'll see you on the road next week, or if not, at the Benelux Oscars in a couple of weeks' time. But wherever you are in the world, until I see you again, stay safe.